I think we can start our second webinar. Good day, everyone, again. Welcome to all of you joining us for the second session of our 2025 webinar series on operation resilience. My name is Eddie Rizk. I'm a consultant and an ex-banker with more than 15 years of experience in the operation risk and business continuity domain. And I'm pleased to be your host and one of the panelists for today's session. As the chair of the session, I'll be guiding us through today's agenda and facilitating our discussion. So for those who didn't join us last time, and actually even for those who joined us, let me just briefly recap what we discussed in our last webinar. So in the first webinar, we actually explored the evolving regulatory landscape surrounding operation resilience. And we discussed what operation resilience truly means, why regulators are placing increased emphasis on it, and what do they expect from financial institutions. Also, we discussed how existing frameworks like business continuity and ORM can be aligned to meet these rising expectations. So this second session actually picks up from there. However, we shift our focus to a major, and allow me to say it's sometimes underestimated, challenge in the resilience space, which is third-party risk. So today's session, which is titled Operation Resilience and the Elephant in the Room, we will dive into the vulnerabilities and risks that arise from third-party dependencies. And we will discuss how institutions can embed resilience into their third-party ecosystems. So we'll be looking at several things. We'll be looking at how third-party and outsourcing risk are evolving, how can institutions effectively manage outsourcing risk. We'll discuss what regulators now expect regarding third-party oversight and the critical third-party mapping. We're gonna as well share some lessons learned from a real life example, which is the CrowdStrike incident, which I'm pretty sure most of you have heard about. And we're going to discuss how to embed resilience within your vendor management lifecycle. So basically, this is not just about theory. It's about understanding your exposure. It's about preparing for the unexpected. And it's about ensuring continuity even when external service providers are disrupted. So in this regard, I'm delighted to be joined again by a group of leading experts in the field. Mr. Andrew Sheen, he's a former PRA regulator and a global risk advisor. We have Dr. David Goodyear, a senior executive with over 3 decades of experience in the operation and risk function. And last but not least, we have Dr. Jimmy Hinchliffe, a highly respected consultant with deep expertise in resilience, regulation, and operational risk. So together, we'll explore the global and local developments shaping third-party risk oversight and how firms in the region can prepare to meet these expectations head-on. Today's agenda is basically straightforward. We're going to do the presentation, then we're going to open the floor for answering your questions, and we're going to conclude with some final remarks. As always, we encourage you to post your questions in the chat box. So we'll do, of course, our best to take up as many as time allows. And if you have any suggestions for the upcoming session, we still have one webinar left. Please feel free to share this too. And just one final note before we begin: if you like to have a one-on-one discussion with any of our experts to discuss any challenge, any topic you might be facing, we'd be happy to support. We'd be happy to take this. So just please feel free to contact us or to drop us an email or a text in the chat box. So with that, let's dive in. I'll hand it over to Jimmy, Dr. Jimmy. So to you, Dr. Jimmy is going to kick it off by framing actually the third-party challenge and how it's reshaping the resilience agenda globally. So Dr. Jimmy, to you.
Great, thanks, Ellie. And we'll be a little bit quicker this time in terms of the content in the slides. So last time we gave a lot of the foundation. This time we're going to give a bit more time for the Q&A. We had a lot of questions last time, for sure. So this first slide will be familiar from last time. The BCBS says consultation paper there. They consulted almost 5 years ago in August 2020, and then they issued their final principles in March 2021. Same time as the UK issued its final policy as well on operational resilience. So these are the Basel principles, the BCBS principles. Of course, the BCBS also has principles on third-party risk management that were issued about a year ago in July 2024, and we expect those to be issued finally soon. But these are the principles. If we go on to the next slide, please, Ellie. What we've done there is we've highlighted this particular principle, Principle 5, which is around banks mapping or managing their dependencies on relationships, including but not limited to third parties or intragroup entities for the delivery of critical operations. So here we have what we often call the elephant in the room, or what is often a grey rhino within institutions. One of the key potential threats to resilience coming from that third-party ecosystem, and that's going to be the focus for today's session. If we go on to the next slide, Ellie. Again, I'll be reasonably brief here. So those of you who've seen or maybe even kindly bought our new book, Integrated Operational Risk Management, will know that we're very big in terms of this kind of integrated approach and the non-financial risk umbrella. Vendor risk management is one of the key components of that non-financial risk umbrella. And the whole point of the regulatory focus on operational resilience is that you're using the tools and the frameworks that you have for the different aspects of non-financial risk to help deliver this outcome of a better level of operational resilience. And you'll see there at the bottom, in terms of BCBS Principle 2 on operational resilience, banks leveraging their respective functions for the management of operational risk to deliver the operational resilience outcomes. And clearly, vendor risk management is a key part of that. I won't go through again the reasons for, or the reasons why having an integrated approach is so important. We covered those last time in terms of the lessons from the conduct risk debacle post the global financial crisis, where we saw this creation of duplicative, inefficient, replicative functions for conduct. But the whole thing here is having an integrated approach and using the tools of vendor risk management to help deliver these operational resilience outcomes. And on that note, I'll hand over to Andrew to take it forward.
Yeah, Andrew, before taking it, if I may, there is a question from the audience which I'd like to pose, and since we're on that slide. So one of the questions is, could you give a practical example on what differentiates a third-party control from a resilience-focused control?
So I would say that's the wrong way of looking at things. So resilience, operational resilience isn't a risk that you control. Operational resilience, as regulators have talked about it, is an outcome. It's an outcome of other things, and it's obviously impacted by various risks, particularly in the non-financial risk, operational risk space. And it's around having controls around those operational risks to help you deliver on those operational resilience outcomes. And clearly, having controls around third-party risks is going to be a key part of that. So I'd say that's the way to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I hope this answers the question. If not, please share it again, whatever highlights or notes you have. Okay, so moving on.
So what this is in this slide in a nutshell is the reason why third-party risk management is so crucial from an operational resilience perspective. And we talked at the first session about operational resilience being a key issue for regulators globally, and therefore it comes from that third-party risk management is a key issue. And the reality is that you as a firm remain responsible if a third party on whom you rely, whether wholly or in part, to provide an important business service fails to remain within impact tolerance or tolerance for disruption, or causes your firm to do so. So citing an example that we had in the UK recently, the credit card provider for one of the major banks had a failure. That meant that people that were using this bank's credit card weren't able to use their credit cards on a Monday morning. They weren't able to do things like buy train tickets to get to work. But the responsibility for that disruption remained with the bank that the credit card provider was providing the credit cards for. You can't say it's nothing to do with us as an organization. It's all to do with the credit card provider. So on this slide, we're saying there that the third party on whom you rely is key. And if we can move on to the next slide, this is, third party risk management is really difficult and complex. It becomes even more complex when you appreciate that if your third party uses a fourth party or fifth or whatever, and that fourth or fifth or nth party fails, you still remain responsible. And that's why it's so important to look at the nth parties that you have. And I'm going to hand over to David now, but we're going to come back later and look at an example of this, which was CrowdStrike. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Andrew. So just going back to the kind of the UK blueprint. Yeah, the next slide. Thanks, Ali. So on this, we talked about this last week, and also the fact that the UK regulator in essentially going first in being relatively prescriptive on this has actually shown kind of how to do it, which then means that can be used as a blueprint in other jurisdictions. Maybe there where the regulation is maybe, let's say, more BAL-based, maybe at a slightly higher level, which allows you to kind of cherry pick or choose the elements of the UK regulation, which can be really helpful. So what we've highlighted here in these 8 steps is 4 and 5, where you're mapping important business services end to end. So again, mentioned last week that you look at either the important business service or the critical function that's been identified, and really looking at that kind of end to end, not just in silos, if you like. So I used the example of a payment before. A payment is, or the customer requests a payment, the payment is received, is processed, and then the customer receives their money. Is a very quick kind of run through at high level. The UK regulator on, and again, can't really emphasize enough how much third parties is becoming a major part of this, a major focus. So within that, you need to identify essentially kind of the people, the processes, the technology, but the third parties that are required to deliver that actual either service or critical function. So by doing this, you are identifying the third parties that you're relying on, and also within systems, if this is all documented, if a third party fails, you can see which of your important business services, or in fact, which of your services or functions are actually impacted as well. Having done that, having done the mapping, the idea behind the mapping is then to use these severe but plausible scenarios to identify vulnerabilities. So again, this isn't just business continuity, it builds on business continuity, but you're really looking at the fact that something has failed within the mapping. So, you're looking at the fact that actually you've lost Bloomberg, or you've lost your correspondent bank, or you've lost one of your important functions, or your core banking system. And then it's, well, what would you do to recover? And how would you recover within the time frame that you set to do so, your impact tolerance? So third parties form a key part of this. And again, with third parties and immature frameworks, and with your important third parties, they will potentially be joining in with your business continuity testing as well, and potentially even with your scenarios. So this is a hugely focused area, and again, we're seeing this. We know that SAMA are looking at on third-party risk management as a particular focus, and so are other regulators. So if we just go to the next slide.
Thank you, David. Before moving on to the next, and I know you answered this partially, but there are 2 questions actually from the audience on this slide, and it would be helpful to give practical examples the way you did. So the first question is, how do you assess if a vendor can meet your tolerance for disruption, especially in cases where they themselves, like Andrew mentioned earlier, they rely on third or fourth parties or end party. And the second question is, how do you recommend we design a test scenario involving a major vendor failure? Like, what would be the starting point?
So if I take the second one first, and you'll probably have to remind me of the first one because I'll have forgotten it by the time I get there.
All right.
So let me try and answer the second one in maybe two parts. So one is, in your traditional business continuity, your disaster recovery testing that your third party could well take part in, and support you in that, which is very focused on them, if you like. And I think the second part of that is when you're standing back and looking at resilience, which is when something really has failed. What are you going to do about it? You've gone beyond your tolerance. How do you actually get back? Who will you be communicating with? So it's really the wider framework, I think, around operational resilience, rather than just recovering the system, but who are you going to communicate while you're doing that? Having plans in place for those communications, really tying it in with the whole framework, your crisis management team, which means that you're back up and running quickly. It's a different way of looking at things, if that makes sense. Sorry, Nelly, can you remind me of the first question, please, because I have forgotten.
Yeah, sure. So the first question was, how do you assess if a vendor can meet your tolerance of disruption, especially when they rely themselves on other parties, like Andrew mentioned, third or fourth?
Yeah. Okay. So again, coming back to, are you visiting them? Are they participating in your tests? Are you getting sight of the testing they're doing? Do you have sight of their fourth parties? Also, are they regulated? What standards are they having to adhere to? What jurisdictions are they in? So it's, and maybe some of part of the answer of this will come on the next slide when we kind of look at the third party life cycle as well, and kind of go through that on how essentially this is kind of the onboarding, the ongoing, and the offboarding through the third party risk management life cycle. Yeah.
All right. Thanks,
Okay.
David.
Okay.
So moving on.
Yeah. So just at the top here, we've got the source and select. So this is, where were you talking about, Ellie? Will they be able to satisfy? This is really the entry point, and to be able to really assess, are they meeting your standards? Again, I think we've talked about last week, and certainly we're talking with people about kind of Bloomberg, Microsoft, the fact that these are giant companies who really have very little interest in sharing with you their resilience plans. It's essentially kind of take it or leave it, which in some ways is understandable, but it's not very comforting all of the time. So really, do they have robust plans? Do they fit into your framework? Do they meet your standards as well? And I think also one of the third thing about third-party risk management is the relationship is hugely important. Do you trust the people that you rely on? Are they proactive? Do they communicate with you? When something goes wrong, do they let you know what's happening, etc.? Are they responsive back to you? I think it's hugely important in your relationship and your management of your third parties. So then, you've sourced, you select, then you're kind of in your onboarding. And then this is where, where do they fit into your plans? Where do they fit into your scenarios, into your mapping, etc.? So this is where they're entering the operational resilience framework and the mapping, and therefore the scenarios, etc. If they meet the criteria that they are impacting upon your either important business services or your critical functions or critical operations. And then this is what's, I think, really interesting, and this is where things, I think, have progressed. I'm not sure how many people are aware of this, but this real kind of risk assessment that now needs to take place around third parties. Yes, you've got your RCSAs, you've got your control assessments, your scenario tests. Then you've got your assess and remediate, which is ongoing. What are you doing? You have an issue, which can be through an incident that's occurred with the third parties. And then you've got, traditionally your monitor and validate and measure and performance, against your SLAs. So you're going to have SLAs in place. Are they actually doing what they will do? When they have an outage, do they recover within the SLA that you've got with them? This is really telling telling you how they perform day to day. And then offboarding is a big one. You know, how do you maintain resilience on offboarding? And again, for the bigger banks, you've got operational continuity in resolution, you know, where you actually have to have plans in place for your third parties. You know, if a crisis occurs and you've got a sudden offboarding or loss of a third party, what are your contingency plans? Which is all part of resilience. What would you do if, again, it's not always practical, but at least if you thought about it and documented that and have that signed off by senior management, you know, then you can have your regulator, well, hopefully will recognize that. So there's this whole now third-party risk management life cycle, which I think is really becoming of huge importance and is actually coming to life in the industry. It's a real change, I think, that's going on at the moment and a real focus.
Sure. And
Yeah.
David, actually, we have a question here. Since you mentioned the RCSA previously in one of your points, we have one question that is saying that how can like tools of, you know, like the known tools of ORM, like such RCSA, really help when it comes to TPRM? You mentioned it by passing, so if you can give maybe a more
Sure. So, you know, as we said, resilience is an outcome of good operational risk management. So within your RCSA, you know, you should be capturing concerns that you have over your third-party risks. You know, how are they performing? So, you know, you will have the opportunity, or should have the opportunity through your operational risk framework, if you like, to identify, escalate as appropriate, and then take action. It doesn't have to be around incidents or scenario testing. It's the whole toolkit of the operational risk framework, which again I think is one of the strengths of operational risk.
True, thank you. And another question that just came in. So someone is asking, how should contracts and agreements be changed, if they need to be changed, to tackle the issue of operation resilience, or to take it into consideration?
So again, in the UK, there's now kind of essentially a contract checklist of what you'd expect to see in a contract with your third-party supplier. So again, we've worked with clients, we've helped them develop their frameworks, you know, and these checklists, these risk assessments are integral to that, and then are being, you know, reviewed by senior management on a periodic basis. So again, look at, you know, the UK regulation really, I think, is really strong in this area.
David, if I can just interject, I had exactly this experience where I was working with a bank, a European bank, and one of the reasons that I was asked to go in was because they'd actually found that their third-party contracts didn't support their third-party risk management. They didn't support operational resilience. That was partly a fault of the organization, or principally a fault of the organization, because they just kept re-signing the same contracts. But I think the key point is that your contracts should recognize that your third party needs to be resilient, what the resilience expectations are. What are your expectations when you're doing testing? What are your expectations when they're doing testing? Can they, you know, is it built into the contract that if they're running tests, they should involve you? So these are all things that are in that checklist and should be captured as part of these contracts, because otherwise, the bank I was working with, they kind of got two responses when they realized this from people whose contracts weren't up to date enough. And one was people who said, yep, everybody else has got it, you know, we're welcome, we're surprised you haven't asked before. And the other one was literally, it's not in the contract, so we're not going to do it. So it's crucial that you look at your contracts when they come up for renewal and you modify them to reflect all aspects of this third-party risk management life cycle. So thanks for that, David.
Thanks, Andrew. Thanks, David.
Yeah. Okay.
So moving on.
Okay, so you'll remember that we had the key steps. David put up key steps. And so as part of that thought process, I just wanted to focus in on the CrowdStrike event. Ellie said, hopefully you've all heard of it and were aware of it at the time, but just by way of a recap, it's 19th of July last year, and CrowdStrike, which is an American cybersecurity company, distributed a faulty update on its sensor security software, and it caused widespread problems with Microsoft Windows computers running the software. An interesting thing, and I never retained the diagram that I saw, but I saw a diagram of nth parties and where CrowdStrike was in the food chain, for want of a better word. And the reality is that I'm sure most people who were recipients of the CrowdStrike service were unaware that they were part of their third-party framework. So it just underlined how difficult it is sometimes to understand your nth parties. So there was a disruption. About 8.5 million systems crashed and they couldn't restart properly. It's been described as the largest outage in the history of information technology, and it pretty much disrupted everybody, including banks and things like emergency services. And someone has estimated that the financial damage was at least 10 billion. The interesting thing was that the error was discovered, a fix was released within hours, but because many of the computers had to be fixed manually, outages continued to linger for many services for quite some time. Now, the UK Financial Conduct Authority had a look at what firms in the UK had done. And so if we can move on to the next slide, we've got a list here. And essentially what the FCA said, there's some next steps and they're on the next slide. But when they looked at it, they found that firms that had completed these 10 steps were better placed to prevent, adapt, respond to, recover, and learn from the CrowdStrike disruption. And that's what operational resilience is about. It's about preventing it, adapting, responding, recovering, and learn. And what were the first two things that the regulator identified? Well, they're the two things that David highlighted on his key steps. Firms that had mapped their important business services and the resources necessary to deliver those services were better placed, were more resilient, and firms that had undertaken rigorous scenario testing were more resilient. And I just want to hone in a bit on scenario testing because, as I pointed out, CrowdStrike really was, a long way away from in the food chain. Firms have said to me, well, we would never have tested, CrowdStrike going down. But the key thing is that their service that they were involved in providing went down. And that's the thing you need to be testing. So what happens if one of my cloud providers goes down? What am I going to do? And when we look at scenarios testing and when we help firms with scenario testing, we usually start with a storyline. So, why we're testing this, why has it gone down? And it may be that an nth party has failed. But the reality is, although the storyline is helpful, the thing that you're scenario testing is that it's happened. Because certainly we've had some interesting discussions with firms in scenario testing when IT said, well, it couldn't happen here because of this, this, and this. And we had to say, forget about the storyline. It's that this has happened. And so firms that have undertaken rigorous scenario testing were better placed to respond. And I think it's partly about as a result of rigorous scenario testing, you've adopted a resilience mindset, so you're able to respond much quicker. Certainly, firms that adopted clearly defined and tested communications were in a better place. And also the regulator found that some organizations had deliberately procured systems on different builds and devices. So they were building in resilience along the end-to-end process at various parts in the end-to-end process because they weren't reliant on just a single device. Also, firms that had revised their change management processes for software and content updates were better positioned. And we talked a bit there about when the question came up, what about RCSAs? Do they have a role? And when you're looking at employing or having a relationship with a third party, that should go through your change management process. And the change management process, ensuring that everything that needs to be done has been done. And certainly where we've worked with firms on the change management process, one of the things that we've always put into the chain very early on is a risk and control self-assessment of that change management. And obviously that risk and control self-assessment has to be ongoing because the risks will change as you move through that kind of onboarding part of the life cycle. So also the detailed mapping of all third and nth parties, so not just third parties. People that had done that were better able to respond. People that established existing relationships and pathways to share information with third-party providers were well placed. And we have a client, and we were talking to them about the need for their third party to understand their operational resilience requirements. And one of the things that they did was to share their operational resilience policy with the third party, so that the third party was fully aware of the firm's expectations. Of course, if you've ensured that your staff and management are aware of what to do in these circumstances, you're going to be much better placed. My nightmare scenario is that you get the disruption. The disruption happens at 7 in the morning. By the time everybody's got into work, it's 9 o'clock. By the time you've got everybody that needs to be on your crisis management team assembled, it's 11 o'clock, 12 o'clock. You're already 5 hours into this and you've done absolutely nothing. So have an incident response and crisis management process. People need to be aware of it, and it needs to click in straight away. Also, one of my nightmares is that you have this crisis management team, and I've seen this, and it didn't work well. And then the crisis management team met, they discussed what had happened, and they then started to focus on what should the communication be. And you can imagine if you get 10 very senior managers trying to draft a communication, that takes forever. And what you need are these predefined communication plans. You can pull them off the shelf and you can use them straight away. You know, what is my event? That's this plan, and use it straight away. And also, and it's this contractual point, firms were better positioned if they had contracts clearly setting out responsibilities with third parties. So that's the FCA's findings for who was best able to prevent, adapt, respond, recover, and learn from this. But on the next slide, we've also got some next steps, some recommendations from the regulator. I think the first one's key. Consider if your current testing scenarios are adequate. One of the things that's happening as regulators focus on operational resilience and third-party risk management is the expectations of some of the processes that a lot of people have been doing. The expectation has increased significantly. So we've had clients who said, oh, well, we do this tests on our system regularly. Isn't that enough? And the answer is it isn't. I think you need a formal scenario testing program with everything that involves. Make sure that you test updates before deployment. The number of times in the UK and globally, we see firms who have a disruption because the update wasn't adequately tested. You need to review your third-party management frameworks regularly. This isn't something you do once and forget about it for your third party. You need to be constantly reviewing it to see if anything's changed. And as part of that review, that will tell you you may need to change your third-party categorization, risk assessment and management process. And by categorization, I mean, you know, you've got various levels of materiality. Has the materiality of that particular third party changed since you last assessed it? Certainly review their performance. And one of the questions is always, how do I get comfortable that my third party can match my tolerance for disruption or impact tolerance? And one is by looking at their performance. If your third party is saying they can be up and running in 2 hours, and they've just had an incident and it took 4 hours, that shows you that there's an issue there that you need to understand. Considering and understanding into dependencies, this is, as I'm sure you've realized, this is extremely difficult thing to do, but it's crucial. Again, making your communications more efficient through pre-approved communication templates. You pull them off the shelf. That when the disruption happens at 7 o'clock, someone can trigger that first initial communication. So have that out there for your customers and clients. Review your contracts, make sure they clearly set out who monitors the service, how incidents are notified, and any timely updates. And then lastly, and I think this is key, conduct a post-incident review following a significant disruption. Now, one of the things that we're seeing, we have it in the UK, we have it in Europe with DORA, and it is happening in some jurisdictions globally, is that the regulator is expecting you to undertake an incident review. Now, if I look at the UK, for example, that review is in 4 parts. The first is a kind of notification of the organization. The second is a description of the incident and what you're doing. There's another notification, which is an intermediate report saying where you are and how it's progressing. And then finally, there's the last review, which is obviously to demonstrate that everything's been completed. So one of the areas where third-party risk management is being enhanced is this regulatory requirement about incident reviewing. So with that, I'll pass over to you, Ellie, for the Q&A.
Yeah, actually, we have 2 questions on the slide before, and one actually is a recurring question, but it's beneficial to repeat it. So basically, one is asking, like, there are some vendors that really are not, collaborative, and they don't share information or, what is needed. So what can we do in this?
Well, at the end of the day, you remain responsible for the service critical operation that's reliant on that vendor. So if you can't get the reassurances that you need from the vendor, I would strongly suggest you find another vendor. One of the things that I'm pleased to see happening is vendors are expecting people to be asking these sorts of questions. It's a valuable business tool if they can demonstrate that they're resilient. So if you can't get those answers from your vendor, then really the only solution I think you have is to find another vendor that will provide that service and will answer the questions that you have.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Another question before we proceed with the Q&A, the other Q&A actually. So one is asking, should critical third parties be involved in operation resilience scenario? And if you can give an example, an actual example, like what type of scenarios, for example, in banks, we should design and involve those third parties?
So that I talked about working for a European firm, and that was the initial issue that they had, that they wanted to involve their third parties in their testing. And that was not only kind of systems testing, but also scenario testing. So yes, they should be. In an ideal world, if you run a workshop that's impacting an important business service and your third party is a resource for that important business service, then they should be involved in the test. You can't underestimate the value when you're scenario testing of getting the right people in the room. And certainly our experience has been that when we've been able to do that, or when that has happened with our clients, the level of discussion and the impact of the scenario is greatly enhanced. And also, it's easier to identify. Sorry, it's easier to identify potential solutions to whatever it is that you're dealing with. And it may be that your third party has a solution. So for me, part of the contract should be that your third parties are involved in your testing and your scenario testing.
All right, thanks. So moving on to the Q&As. So thank you, first of all, Andrew, Jimmy, and David, for your insightful and really rich information. So let me share with you some few questions which we have. So the first question is, someone is saying that we already have robust third-party risk assessment and vendor due diligence process. So how this is different actually from what the regulators are now asking under Operation Resilience?
Maybe if I can just take that one first, I think probably to do a gap analysis against kind of what regulators are now asking for. You can do a gap analysis relatively quickly. You can see where you are versus what is now the regulatory expectation, and essentially take it from there. Yeah, and doing those assessments kind of fairly regularly is very important. Making sure you're up to date, I think, with the regulatory requirements. Good market practice, I think, is really key.
And this I'm reminded of that adage which I managed to get in the webinar, so I'll give myself a tick, which is absence of evidence is evidence of absence. So you might think that your third party and process and vendor due diligence process meets regulatory expectation, but if you can't demonstrate that that's the case, then no one is going to believe that you meet expectation. So I think it's about, as David said, one good approach is a gap analysis, normally best done, I think, by somebody independent. I've seen too many people who've marked their own homework and assessed themselves as best in class when someone independent came in and that wasn't the case. But, if you look at the regulatory expectations that are emerging globally, expectations around scenarios and what they involve, expectations around contracts and what they involve, too many organizations work in silos when they look at third-party risk management. So all those issues, there's a definite upgrade in regulatory expectations. Regulators don't go down these sorts of paths if they don't think that there's a weakness that needs to be resolved. And the particular element of third-party risk management I always refer to is your register. So if you look at DORA, if you look at the UK expectations that are currently out for consultation, and if you look at other regulators where they have published their expectations for the third-party risk management register, there's about 50 cells per third party. So, the most obvious question to ask is, do you even meet that basic requirement for your register? I don't know if anyone wants to add anything.
Just to add slightly to that, I think as well, it's important not to be complacent. Just because, as David and Andrew have both said, the expectations from regulators really have increased quite dramatically. And just to mention three things quickly that haven't been mentioned so far, where there has been this raising of the bar in terms of regulatory expectations. One is around the scope. So all regulators, and this is also set out in the BCBS principles on third-party risk management that I mentioned, have broadened the scope of what they're talking about here. So previously regulators would talk about outsourcing, and that was the only focus. Now we're talking about third parties. A material third party, a non-outsourcing arrangement is just as important as managing an outsourcing arrangement. So bringing those within the perimeter of what you're doing is a huger thing, potentially. Certainly when we work with clients, bringing in those material third parties, putting them through the risk assessment, materiality assessment, and then applying the same kind of process is a big a big challenge. Second one, sub-outsourcing. So having that look through. It's not enough now to understand and know your third parties. You need to then look through and understand what are the fourth parties. What is the sub-outsourcing? CrowdStrike just been mentioned. Key aspect of that. All regulators are looking at that. Everyone now needs to have basically a register of sub-outsourcing so you can understand what are those concentration risks. And then the third one, finally, intra-group. Really, definitely this really is the biggest elephant in the room, if you like, because people have talked and regulators have talked for a long time about treating intra-group the same as you would treat external third parties. But in practice, I think most organizations have treated them rather differently. Again, that is no longer something that's going to be appropriate. You need to apply a robust approach to vendor risk management, including to your intra-group dependencies. And again, we referred to it last time, I think, in terms of the UK policy around third-party risk management, but there's some really good guidance within there in terms of the approach to intra-group outsourcing and how the extent to which you have control and influence over the intra-group arrangement can help to mitigate some of the risk around that. But again, capturing those dependencies on third parties is going to be critical, and then managing them, and then ensuring that potential weaknesses and vulnerabilities and threats to your resilience are captured and managed and included, obviously, within your testing.
We have a question here, guys. So the question is, who should own third party, and those changes and the governance and, those structural changes that some regulators are asking. So one of the attendees is asking who should own the third party risk assessment function, or who should do that? Is it with procurement and on the administrative level, for example? Should it be with op risk or op resilience? So if you can kindly answer this question.
The approach I always apply to make sure that it's consistent is what happens about operational risk, and that's not unreasonable because operational resilience is an outcome of good operational risk management. And so for operational risk, the policy and the governance arrangements are owned in the second line. The first line is responsible for implementing that policy. And obviously the second line also exercises oversight and challenge over the activities of the first line. And so I think the same, logically, the same applies on third-party risk management. The policy should be owned in the second line. The first line should implement that policy. And so for me, that would involve in wherever your vendor assessment process sits, they should be doing the first line should be doing the assessment, and the second line should be challenging that particular assessment. And obviously there's a role for the third line. So its policy sits in the second line, implementation in the first line, and reporting in the first line. But obviously the reporting is often coordinated in the second line. So that's how I see these things.
Thanks, Andrew. Another question is a tabletop exercise sufficient to test our operation resilience policy or our operation resilience capabilities?
So maybe if I just go first, I think that's just one tool in the armory. So, a lot of the traditional testing is very important. I think tabletop testing plays a role where you're getting all interested parties around the table, if you like. And there's challenge as to, well, what would you really do? And then that goes beyond just lip service to really probe. So I think tabletop exercises, particularly around resilience and your third parties, and well, what would you really do, plays an important part, but it all then builds into everything else we've talked about, the third parties joining, testing, etc. So it's just one tool in the whole armory, but can be useful in pulling things together, all the other aspects.
Yeah, one of the things that we do when we run a scenario workshop, which I see as different from a tabletop exercise. One of the key steps is to pull together what we call information and artifacts, and they are presented to the workshop as part of their consideration of the scenario. And certainly a tabletop, I would expect tabletop testing, any testing that you've done of the system, to be one of those, to be part of that information and artifacts that we're collecting. But David's right, it's a key part, but it's just one of the things that you need to pull together in order to assess how you're going to respond if there's a disruption, but also more importantly, if that disruption is going to cause you to breach your tolerance for disruption or impact tolerance.
I think where you start to see a bit more on the live testing side, and certainly this is what we've seen with some of our clients, is when you've done the scenario workshop, you've gone through a particular type of disruption, and then you've come up with some potential plan Bs that you think will allow you to continue providing the service within your tolerance. And then maybe one of the actions coming out of that workshop is that you need to document those plan Bs, and then you may well want to test them. So it could be, for instance, that you've decided that a potential plan B would be to make payments through a different channel, but you've never tested that and you haven't documented it. So you document it, and then you actually test whether you could actually do that in practice. Whether you could deal with the increased volumes, for instance, in making additional payments through that particular channel. So that is the area I think that you're starting to see, and I think certainly in the UK that is the expectation from regulators now as things become more embedded and a little bit more sophisticated in terms of taking that testing onto the next stage and really documenting and being clear that actually we've come up with these plan Bs, and now we've actually demonstrated that they are doable, that they are workable in practice. So I think that's an important addition to the workshops.
Yeah, and I think sometimes you come up with kind of key person dependencies that there is someone who knows how to do it. It's in their head. They know what they would do, but it's not documented. So if they're not around or they leave, then that knowledge goes with them, which is intrinsic to the firm.
I'm just gonna take one more question because honestly, we don't want to step outside the time frame for everyone. So, last question for this webinar. Hopefully, we'll answer the remaining ones in the next webinar. So, what do you recommend to put as KPIs or KRIs to monitor third-party resilience, performance, or risks? If you can give just a couple of examples.
Maybe if I mention kind of compliance with SLA. And risk appetite as a couple of things.
And I'd add to that, David. Are they experiencing disruption? So that would be an indicator I would want to collect. So as I'm seeing their experience of disruptions.
Sorry, Andrew. No, I was just going to say, again, it's not looking at operational resilience as something that is kind of different and in a silo. So it's actually using a lot of what you're already doing as part of operational risk management to give that insight into resilience. So, even KRIs that you have linked to key risks within RCSA, hopefully as part of your embedding of resilience in RCSA, you can now identify what are those critical resources that you need to deliver a critical operation or important business service, and what are the risks that relate to those. And then hopefully you will have KRIs that relate to those risks. So again, that will be an important feed into the understanding the risk profile in terms of operational resilience, and you can almost create kind of a synthetic RCSA and a synthetic KRI report relating to a particular critical operation.
Yeah, and let me add to what you guys said, like maybe at least for me, the most important performance indicator, and which I recommend everyone, is to actually monitor their performance in actual live simulation when you design a scenario and you test it. And it's going to be maybe not live, a simulation, maybe over the weekend, where you involve your critical third parties and you actually witness their performance. From there, you can really see, you'll have your KPI in front of you. I'm going to wrap. We have a couple of questions, but time won't allow it. So I'm going to wrap this up. I want to thank you all. For those who attended, I'm going to thank Andrew, Jimmy, and David for your insightful thoughts. And let me say that our third webinar is going to be on the 23rd of July. So I hope we'll see you there as well. Before we end, I'd just like to give Jimmy the last word to just speak about this book, which is very interesting, which he wrote with Andrew, and we hope that you all read it.
Well, just to say, Ali, that this is now available, and hopefully it adds something a little bit different in terms of giving that integrated perspective on operational risk management and from a regulatory perspective. Andrew and myself both being former regulators, so please go out and buy it, and cheap at half the price, and we hope to get your feedback.
And there are obviously chapters on. I think one of the things that differentiates this from some of the other books that are out there is that there are chapters on operational resilience and third-party risk management, which, because it's a relatively new regulatory focus, isn't an issue that's covered in a lot of other operational risk publications. So thanks, Ellie.
Thank you. Thank you so much, guys. And thank you, everyone who attended, and have a good day ahead. Thank you, and bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everyone.